Somewhere in a climate-controlled vault at Yale University sits a book that has defeated every codebreaker, linguist, and cryptographer who has ever laid eyes on it. World War I codebreakers failed. World War II codebreakers failed. Modern supercomputers running machine learning models have failed. For over 600 years, one small handwritten book has remained completely, totally unreadable. And today, we're going to find out exactly why. This is the story of the Voynich Manuscript. In April 1639, an alchemist named Georg Barasch sat down to write a letter to one of the most famous scholars in Europe. A Jesuit priest named Athanasius Kircher, celebrated across the continent for supposedly cracking the code of Egyptian hieroglyphics. In that letter, Barasch described a strange book sitting on his shelf, taking up space uselessly, as he put it. It was filled with pictures of plants he didn't recognize, star charts, odd diagrams, and page after page of writing in an alphabet nobody could read. Barasch guessed it might be some kind of medical text. He had no idea what he was looking at. And honestly, neither do we, nearly 400 years later. That book is now known as the Voynich Manuscript, named after the Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich, who bought it in 1912 and brought it to public attention for the first time. Today it lives at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, catalogued as MS408. It measures roughly 23.5 by 16.2 centimeters, small enough to hold in two hands, and originally ran to about 240 pages, of which around 30 are now missing. And here's the headline: nobody, in the entire recorded history of this book, has ever been able to read a single sentence of it. Not medieval scholars, not Renaissance cryptographers, not the codebreakers of 2 world wars, not modern AI. It remains the only book known to exist written in this particular script, and no second example has ever turned up anywhere in the world. So what does 240 pages of unreadable text actually look like? The manuscript isn't just one big block of writing. It breaks down into distinct sections, and each one is stranger than the last. The first and by far the largest section covers around 126 pages and is usually called the botanical section. It's full of drawings of plants, over 100 of them, each accompanied by a short block of text, presumably describing the plant in some way. Here's the catch: not one of these plants can be matched with confidence to any real species. Botanists have tried for a century. Some of the drawings look like chimeras, a root system from one plant fused to leaves from another, flowers that don't correspond to anything in nature. It's as if the illustrator was inventing a fictional botany textbook, or drawing from a garden nobody else has ever seen. Next comes a short section, just a few pages, that looks astronomical. Circular diagrams packed with what appear to be suns, moons, and stars arranged in wheels. Following that is a section of zodiac diagrams. These circular charts contain recognizable astrological symbols: 2 fish for Pisces, a bull for Taurus, a couple holding hands for Gemini, and so on around the wheel. But surrounding each zodiac symbol are rings of tiny naked female figures, each one holding what looks like a star on a string. Nobody has ever adequately explained why. Then things get even odder with the section researchers call biological, about 20 pages showing more naked women, this time bathing in pools and tubs of green liquid, all connected by an elaborate network of pipes and tubes that look almost mechanical, like plumbing diagrams crossed with a spa. After that comes what might be the single strangest page in the whole book, a giant fold-out sheet, 6 panels wide, showing a huge central circle surrounded by 8 smaller circles, all linked by pathways that look like roads, canals, or pipework. Researchers often call this the cosmological section, but honestly, nobody agrees on what it's actually depicting. The 6th section, around 16 pages, is generally labeled pharmaceutical. It shows rows of labeled jars alongside drawings of isolated plant parts, roots, leaves, stems, the kind of thing you'd expect in an apothecary's reference book. And finally, the manuscript closes with a section of pure text, dense paragraphs with no illustrations at all, each one marked in the margin with a small star. One more detail that deserves attention: across all 240 surviving pages, there is almost no crossing out, no visible correction, no scribbled over mistake. For a handwritten document this long, that's bizarre. Either the scribe was superhumanly careful, or, more likely, this wasn't a first draft. It reads like a fair copy, transcribed cleanly from some earlier source. There are a few corrections if you look closely enough, but they're made so precisely, so minutely, that they're almost invisible to the naked eye. The Voynich library has scanned every single page of the manuscript in high resolution and made them publicly available, which has been an enormous gift to researchers and hobbyists alike. Scroll through them and you'll notice something in the corner of many pages. Small numerals in the top right, not symbols from the manuscript's mysterious alphabet, but ordinary Arabic numerals. That tells us immediately that at least one other hand has touched this book at some point after it was written. Someone added page numbers later, in a completely different script. We can actually prove this with a neat piece of physical evidence. On page 13, a numeral sits directly on top of an old water stain. On the following page, page 14, that same water stain has clearly damaged a flower illustration, but left the numeral untouched. That tells us the numbering was added after the water damage occurred, which means it was added by someone handling the book long after it was originally created, consistent with a manuscript that changed hands repeatedly across the centuries. As for who actually wrote it and when, nobody has ever definitively identified the author, but we do have hard science to work with. In 2009, researchers carried out radiocarbon dating on the vellum itself, and the results were tight and consistent. The calfskin pages were produced sometime between 1404 and 1438. That's early to mid-15th century, decades before Barish's letter, which means the book had already been circulating, unread, for roughly 2 centuries before he ever got his hands on it. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint, because the first question any serious researcher has to answer isn't what does it say, it's does it say anything at all. It's entirely possible that some bored or mischievous 15th century scribe simply invented 240 pages of meaningless scribbles purely to hoax future readers, and if that's the case, no one will ever crack it, because there's nothing to crack. So how do we test that? This is where a strange mathematical pattern called Zipf's law comes in. Take any language, English, Spanish, doesn't matter, and count how often each word appears across a large body of text. Rank the words from most frequent to least frequent. What you'll find, almost every single time, is that the second most common word appears about half as often as the most common word. The third most common word appears about a third as often, the fourth, a quarter as often, the fifth, a fifth. It's a strikingly consistent mathematical relationship. A word's frequency is roughly proportional to 1 divided by its rank. This is Zipf's law, and it shows up in English, French, German, Japanese, Ukrainian. Every natural language ever tested, living or dead, seems to follow it. Nobody fully understands why human language behaves this way, but it does, reliably, everywhere. And when researchers ran the same word frequency analysis on the Voynich Manuscript symbols and word-like clusters, it follows Zipf's law almost as cleanly as any known natural language, and closely matches the curve you get from real languages across Europe, Asia, and Africa. That's a big deal. It strongly suggests the person who wrote this wasn't just scribbling nonsense. This really does behave like structured language, generated by rules, not randomness. Okay, so it's probably meaningful. Now how do you actually break it? To understand why the Voynich manuscript has resisted every attempt at decryption, you need to understand a concept from information theory called entropy, specifically letter entropy. Think about the letter Q in English. What letter almost always comes right after it? U. In fact, if you saw a smudged word starting with Q, you could bet with extremely high confidence that the next letter is U, and the letter after that is very likely a vowel. That predictability is a form of low entropy. The more predictable a language's letter sequences are, the lower its entropy score. A language where letters follow each other in wildly unpredictable ways, closer to random noise, would have high entropy. Every known human language sits somewhere on that entropy scale, and linguists have actually charted it out for dozens of languages. Now here's the twist. When researchers calculated the entropy of the Voynich manuscript's text, after building a standardized transcription alphabet, the most widely used one is called the European Voynich alphabet, or EVA. The number that came back was startlingly low. Around 2-3, well below the entropy of any known human language on the chart, including famously low entropy languages, and dramatically lower than what you'd expect from a random cipher. Why does that matter so much? Because of how encryption actually works. Take a simple substitution cipher, the kind Julius Caesar supposedly used, where you just shift every letter of the alphabet forward by a fixed number, so A always becomes, say, D, B always becomes E, and so on. If you encrypt a normal English sentence this way, you can absolutely crack it using frequency analysis. Figure out which symbol appears most often, guess that it corresponds to E, the most common letter in English, work out the next most frequent symbol as probably T or A, and keep refining your guesses using patterns, like the fact that certain letter pairs are common and others never occur, until the plaintext emerges. It's basically what people do when they solve a newspaper cryptogram. Crucially, a simple substitution cipher doesn't change the entropy of the underlying message at all. It just swaps the symbols around one for one. So if you tried this approach on the Voynich Manuscript, hoping it was just a substitution cipher in disguise, the entropy should match a normal language. It doesn't. It's far too low. Could it be a more complex cipher then? Something called a polyalphabetic cipher, where a single letter can be encrypted as different symbols depending on its position in the message. Systems like the Visionaire cipher, the Alberti cipher disk, or centuries later, the Enigma machine, all work this way, and they were absolutely available as concepts in the early 1400s. Cryptography as a discipline was already being actively developed by Italian and German inventors of that era. Take the engineer Giovanni Fontana, for example, who around 1420 wrote a treatise called Bellicorum Instrumentorum Liber, half of it in medieval Latin and half in a cipher of his own invention, illustrated throughout with drawings of the machines and devices he was describing. Some of those illustrations bear an eerie resemblance in style to the plant drawings in the Voynich Manuscript. There's also the famous case of a 19th century diary written by the Italian engineer Ernesto Rignano in an extremely tiny, cramped cipher script, so small it required a magnifying glass to read, which remained unsolved for over a century until a cryptographer finally cracked it in the 2010s and revealed it was simply Italian text with numbers substituted in a particular way. So the historical precedent for illustrated coded manuscripts absolutely exists, but there's a problem with applying that theory to the Voynich manuscript. Polyalphabetic ciphers, by their very nature, tend to increase entropy rather than decrease it, because the same letter can map to multiple different symbols depending on context, which adds statistical noise and disorder to the output. Encryption, generally speaking, either preserves entropy, simple substitution, or raises it, polyalphabetic systems. It essentially never lowers it below the entropy of ordinary language. And remember, the Voynich manuscript's entropy isn't just normal, it's abnormally low, lower than any recorded human language, including the lowest entropy languages we know of in Asia. That single fact is a serious problem for the "it's secretly a cipher" theory. If anything, it points the other way, toward the idea that Voynichese might not be an encrypted version of some other language at all, but rather a language, or language-like system, in its own right, sometimes now informally nicknamed Voynichese. Possibly a constructed language, possibly a genuinely lost natural language. Nobody knows for certain, but a cipher explanation doesn't fit the data nearly as well as people initially assumed. This isn't actually unprecedented in the history of writing systems. Egyptian hieroglyphics, the writing system combining hieroglyphic, hieratic, and demotic scripts, sat completely unread by modern scholars for well over 1,000 years. Plenty of people throughout history claim to have cracked it. None of them actually had. That changed only in 1799, when French soldiers near the Egyptian town of Rashid stumbled on a large carved stone slab containing the same decree written 3 times, once in hieroglyphics, once in Egyptian demotic script, and once in ancient Greek, which scholars could already read fluently. That stone, the Rosetta Stone, gave linguists the missing key, a direct word-for-word comparison between a known language and an unknown one. Jean-François Champollion used it to finally crack hieroglyphics decades later, and an entire lost writing system opened up almost overnight. The problem for the Voynich manuscript is that no equivalent Rosetta Stone has ever surfaced, no parallel text in a known language, no bilingual key, and without one, an unknown script can remain permanently unread, no matter how much computing power you throw at it. These are formally called undeciphered scripts, and the Voynich manuscript is far from the only one. Rongorongo, the glyph system carved into wooden tablets on Easter Island in the 19th century, remains unread today despite numerous attempted decipherments. The same is true of several other scripts from around the world, systems where we have plenty of physical examples, but no bridge back to a language we already understand. The Voynich Manuscript's specific challenge is arguably even harder, because on top of having no bilingual key, it's also the only known example of its script anywhere on Earth. Every other undeciphered writing system at least has multiple inscriptions to cross-reference. Voynichese exists in exactly one place, this one book. Across those pages, researchers count more than 170,000 individual characters, forming somewhere around 35 to 40,000 distinct words, built from roughly 20 to 30 recurring symbols, depending on how you count ligatures and variants. And after all that data, across nearly a century of serious academic study, still nothing, not one confirmed word. We're not completely in the dark, though. Careful study has revealed real structural patterns. The text runs left to right, top to bottom, the same directional convention used by most European languages of the period. Certain symbol pairings show up constantly, almost like the way Q and U pair up in English. One particular Voynichese character is almost always followed by another specific character, over and over, page after page. There's also a noticeable stylistic split across the manuscript. Some pages show tight, compressed, almost cramped handwriting. Other pages are looser, more spaced out, with straighter, more deliberate strokes. Researchers going back to the 1970s, starting with a codebreaker named Prescott Currier, identified these as two distinguishable hands or writing styles, informally labeled Language A and Language B, and each uses a slightly different statistical distribution of symbols, almost like two dialects within the same overall system. More recent analysis has pushed this further, suggesting the manuscript may actually have been produced by as many as 5 different scribes working across different sections, not just 1 or 2. Now here's the part of the story that's genuinely current. Researching this topic, I kept running into the same name, Lisa Fagin Davis, a medieval manuscript scholar and the executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, who has spent years doing forensic, physical analysis of the Voynich Manuscript, not trying to translate the text itself, but studying the book as a physical object. Medieval manuscripts like this one are built from large sheets called bifolia, one big sheet folded in half to create 2 facing pages, front and back. Multiple bifolia get nested inside one another to form a bundle called a quire, and quires get stacked and bound together to form the finished book. Because of how nesting works, the page order inside a quire isn't sequential in a simple way. Page 25 might sit right next to page 32 on the same physical sheet, purely because of how the nesting falls, with no logical connection between their content expected. Davis noticed something that shouldn't happen under that model. Pages that are physically distant from each other in the current binding were showing up with matching connected illustrations, as though pages that were meant to be read together had somehow ended up separated. To test this rigorously, she and collaborators used computational text analysis, essentially letting software compare the statistical similarity of the symbol sequences on different pages, without needing to understand what any of it means, purely measuring how alike the writing looks page to page. Under normal circumstances, 2 unrelated pages from the same bifolio shouldn't show much textual similarity. They're different pages after all. But when this analysis was run, certain pairs of pages that shouldn't have anything in common statistically turned out to be highly similar, as if they'd originally been intended to sit next to each other. That pattern kept repeating across multiple pairs of pages. The implication is striking. The Voynich manuscript, as currently bound, may have had its pages reorganized or rebound at some point over the last 600 years, scrambling the intended reading order, meaning generations of researchers may have been analyzing the text in the wrong sequence the entire time. If Davis's reconstructed ordering holds up, it wouldn't decode a single word of Voynichese, but it could hand future codebreakers a dramatically cleaner, more accurate dataset to work with, which is often exactly what a stubborn cipher problem needs to finally crack. So where does that leave us? We know the Voynich manuscript almost certainly isn't gibberish. Its statistics behave too much like real language for that. We know it's probably not a straightforward cipher layered on top of a known language, because its entropy is too low for that to add up mathematically. What we're likely looking at is an actual written language, quite possibly one that existed nowhere else and left no other trace, invented or evolved by whoever produced this single, strange, beautifully illustrated book sometime in the early 1400s. And for 6 centuries, it has kept every single one of its secrets. It's a humbling reminder of just how fragile our grip on language really is. We're the species that decoded hieroglyphics, cuneiform and linear B, and we still can't read a book sitting in a library in Connecticut, written by one of our own ancestors, in our own alphabetic tradition of writing left to right on vellum with a quill. If we can't crack a human-made puzzle like this one, what does that say about our odds of ever understanding communication from somewhere far stranger than 15th century Europe? That's a question for another video.